Hello, welcome to our AMF at Members Discussion Forum. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these forums. The AMF at Members Discussion Forum is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this forum is to bring our app community members an opportunity to engage with some amazing people and to discuss various ways to normalize and educate the community at large about issues related to grief. Our guest today is Dr. Heather Servaty-Sieb. Heather is a professor in the Doctoral Program in Counseling Psychology at Purdue University, Associate Department Head of Educational Studies, and Associate Dean of Student Life in the Honors College. She is well published in the areas of adolescent, young adult bereavement and suicide, social support and grief, and the use of loss as a broad model for conceptualizing significant life events. Her scholarship has been used to support the development of college student grief absence policies at Purdue and other institutions, as highlighted in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Recognition of her scholarly expertise is reflected at national and international levels. She is the past president of the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling, ADEC, and is the 2013 recipient of ADEC's Deaf Educator Award. Heather, welcome. We are delighted to have you with us for this discussion.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you.
Great.
So
Heather, yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, Heather, we first of all are curious just about what brought your interest in college grief, in grief in general. What brought you into that topic, and where you found yourself doing so much research and spending so much time?
Well, I would say that for me, I think my core connection to the field of death and dying really comes from some more non-death losses I had in my life. Sort of some losses in even my preschool years around people who I was very connected and attached to no longer being part of my life. And so I often say that loss was kind of a part of my psychological DNA from those very early kinds of losses. And then over time, certain kinds of death losses, important people in my life and in my adolescence. And then I would say in terms of the college student work, it was really a challenge that was given to me by David Balk at one point when we were at an ADEC conference, and he kind of looked out to the crowd and said, if you're working on a college campus and you're not looking at college student grief, you're not doing your work. You're really not doing what you should be doing in terms of the disenfranchised nature of the grief that is so much a part of it, of the process for grieving college students and young adults. Very much an under-recognized population in terms of their grief, death and non-death related experiences.
Yeah.
Interesting. I do want to say for our audience, we hope to have David on with us today for this conversation. Due to some personal circumstance, he was unable to attend and sends his regrets, and hopefully we'll be able to have him on another conversation. But Heather, that's very interesting how he really drew you in to young adult grief and the research around it. One of the things that really struck me in the research suggests that 1 in every 3, or just about 1 in every 3 young college student is grieving a death loss that occurred within 1 year's worth of time. Would you say that it is fair to assume that transcends to the demographic of the age group and not just college students?
Well, it would be really difficult to say because we really don't have that research. I think there is some indication, though, that those who go to college and higher education have a certain level of higher resource than those who don't. And if we think about it in that sort of way, we know those from lower income households, those from marginalized communities who may not find themselves to college campuses or find their way to college campuses, they are more at risk for grief and bereavement, death and dying situations. And so we don't have the data, but what we know around sort of that data would suggest it might be higher among young adults who are not connected to a college campus. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, it takes some speculation that way, but. Mm-hmm.
So could you, talking about just the research and research numbers and figures and things that you discovered just through numerous projects. I mean, we put a case statement together, and your name is listed all throughout it with your projects that you worked with others on, that you were lead researcher, and your research team just does such wonderful work. What are some of the highlights that you would put out there for us just about college student grief, things that you learned through that research that, if you're talking with people who maybe they're college students themselves, maybe they're professionals in some regard, what are some things that would it be important for them to know about what we do know about college student grief?
That's a very big question.
Leave it to Andy.
But let me give it a shot, and then other people can, chime in and ask questions. I think one of the most important factors for me, and this is perhaps not unique to college students, but I think the overlay of where students are developmentally and contextually really heightens is that feeling of isolation. I mean, when you're grieving, right, the extent to which grief is so unique and so specific to individual people really contributes to the sense of aloneness in it. Because in some ways, as we know existentially, there is no way someone else can understand exactly what you've experienced, whether it's the death of a parent or the sibling or a grandparent. Even if they've had the death of someone that sounds the same, it's not the same. And when you're a college student, you're on a campus, you're in a context where talking about difficult things just doesn't happen. Like, you don't want to bring people down. You don't want to be defined by these difficult sort of life experiences that you've had. So the idea of initiating those conversations is almost near to impossible. And then the idea that you might have peers or those within that context who could appropriately or helpfully support you is also a whole nother question. I mean, we know from some of the research with adolescents and young adults is often there are times they're not equipped to be very supportive of one another. They don't have the life experience, and they may not have, in some cases, the empathy skills yet to really know how to support one another in the best way possible. So it becomes kind of this double wall where grieving students don't reach out, and then their peers don't reach toward them because no one really knows how to approach those conversations with one another. I think for me, connected to that, what a difference it makes when there are others on the campus who do try to approach grieving students, who are present for them. So co-workers, for example, if students have jobs on campus, sometimes those older co-workers can be very helpful and supportive. Residential life staff can be so helpful and supportive to grieving college students. Faculty, and it doesn't take hours of listening. A faculty member who takes 10 or 15 minutes to listen to a grieving student and to acknowledge what they're experiencing can make a tremendous difference. And often we know from the research that students will consider themselves close to a faculty member if they've had maybe 2 10, 15-minute conversations with them. I mean, if someone knows their name, they consider themselves to have a close relationship with that person. And so it doesn't take as much sometimes as I think people believe that it might. We know that the most common death losses for college students are the death of a grandparent or the death of a friend. And those are the two areas for college students where we have the least research and we know the least about. And oftentimes on college campuses, when it's been a grandparent death loss, there's even a heightened level of disenfranchisement because the assumption is that college students and young adults are not close, they're not connected with those grandparents who have died. And it's a very narrow view of what that death means for the whole family system. and how those shifts and changes within the family system really affect the student in a very deep and real and powerful kind of way. It might be the first time they see their parents debilitated by their own grief, be in a situation where they see themselves as capable of offering support, but maybe not knowing how or the best way in which to do that if they were not necessarily really close to that parent who died. I think one of the interesting things when we think about the statistics related to the number of students that experience death losses, one of the things we've done on my team, which we have to do more of, is we've asked students what some of their most stressful life events have been in the last 2 years. And often we get our stats related to death losses from those kinds of studies where we open it up to a whole range of stressful life experiences. And our assumption along the way was that if they had experienced a death, it would also be what they considered the most impactful or most challenging life experience in that time span. And that has not been the case, which is something for us to sort of challenge ourselves on, is that we have these death losses. Sometimes they are the most impactful or powerful stressor that students face, but oftentimes it may not be the death, but it may be these other sort of compounding stressors that are on top of deaths that may be even more powerful for students. So some of the more common sort of stressors that we also study, you know, loss in a broad way on my team, and we use loss to look at these other life events like romantic breakups. So much disenfranchised grief that goes along with romantic breakup loss for college students, career indecision, and the shifting of the whole future that was planned, and the losses that go along with students changing from one sort of disciplinary focus to another. Things like academic setbacks, conflicts with others, you know, interpersonal difficulties, their own illnesses, pressure from parents. I mean, these all, you know, we can't think about death as sort of this individual, discrete experience. Students are in the context of a lot of other challenging sort of life events. So I think I'm going to pause there after sharing some of those broad sort of pieces.
I'd like to see if any of our listeners might have a question for you.
That'd be great.
If you do, just unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Catherine.
Hi,
Thank
Catherine.
you, Fran, for the link. And Dr. Servaty-Sieb, we have met through email, but we haven't met in person. So this is the closest we'll get in person for now.
For now, right?
But it's nice to meet you. I feel like
Very
you're so
good.
oh gosh. I love your work. And so I guess my question, and I guess I'll just do like a one sentence introduction of myself. I'm a graduate student at Columbia School of Social Work, and I am working at the Center for Complicated Grief. Right now I'm in California, and so a lot of my work this past year has been on young adult bereavement. Unfortunately, things got a little disruptive by the global pandemic, so I'm hoping that things will pick up a little bit soon in terms of getting back on track. But something that the reason that I really got interested in this work, my senior year at Duke, I lost my dad to a sudden heart attack, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. No one really knew what to do with me. I stopped going to classes. I was on the varsity rowing team. I quit the rowing team. And so just the way I kind of put it, even in my interview with the Center for Complicated Grief, was I did every maladaptive coping behavior after my father died. And I lived in those behaviors for a little bit. And so really that has formed the base of what I want to do, which is help students. And it's just living it, it's the worst time. And what I kind of, what my question is with the disenfranchised grief and the death loss almost kind of catapults a person into all sorts of losses. And even if it wasn't a death loss, so for me, it was like loss of identity as an athlete, loss of I couldn't get my diploma because I had to retake stats, you know, so there was a lot of cumulative losses. And you're right, no one really knows how to talk about it. It's just an area that I encourage everyone, whatever class I'm in now with Zoom, I'm like, just learn about, you know, I've kind of taken this on in a way that I really want young people to feel supported and just have the dialogue continued. And luckily there's so much work to be done. So I'm happy to be now connected to this research field. But so I'm wondering what's going to happen. What are your thoughts with post-COVID in terms of where the research might be going? And because there are a lot of losses, there's going to be a lot of death losses, but there's also going to be a ton of grief surrounding losses, whether it's, you know, graduations, like jobs, you know, it's just everything is just completely turned on its head. And so I'm really curious about where the research where should we be looking, and what kind of questions should we be asking so that people feel supported in their grief, even if it's not a death loss, like whatever. Anyways, that's my
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we can think about it in a research sort of way, but I think first we want to think about it even in terms of a conceptual sort of way, right? And how can we use what we know now to be both supportive of one another in the face of all of the death and non-death losses we are facing right now, you know, as a community, as a country, as a world. And I do think it's really interesting to think existentially what might come from this, right? And I know that's not as specific as you're asking, but I do wonder what might come from that. Will we have more death awareness as a world? And is there the potential for some sort of post-traumatic growth that comes from this shared trauma that we are in the midst of now? And I do wonder that, I think that would be a really interesting sort of approach, and wondering in terms of research. And what will it look like as we move forward? Will we see more openness for conversations about death and dying? And I think actually it will matter if we go toward those conversations now, right? I mean, death is not talkable, right? We need to make death talkable. And perhaps one of the ways that we can make death talkable is to make loss talkable. And so I've been having a lot of conversations with groups now about using loss in this broad kind of way, and really conceptualizing, as you had said, this whole flipping of our lives upside down in a way where we can delineate all of the losses, not to bring ourselves down, but in a way to absolutely validate and to normalize the extent of our responses right now. Because it's grief, right? What we're experiencing is grief of all of the losses that we encounter in micro and macro ways as we attempt to live our lives. And I think helping people to think about this in a loss-gain kind of way could make a difference for us. If we can have those kind of conversations right now in the midst of this pandemic, maybe we can talk more about death. Maybe we can talk about how even when a person dies, it's not just the death of who they were. It's not the death of their body or the lack of their physical presence. It's all that they were, all that they represented, all the roles they played in our lives, all the ways they supported us, the future we had planned with them, right? It's all of those losses that make death so powerful and impactful. And now we're in a situation where it may or may not be death, but there are a number of losses. And the more we can enfranchise these losses, make them more discussable, look at this as grief and say grief is emotional, it's cognitive, it's physical, it's spiritual, it's social. So what you're feeling right now and the overwhelmness you have in this situation, it is normal. It is a normative response to an abnormal situation. I mean, this pandemic is about as abnormal of a situation that we could find ourselves in. And so the idea that the powerful response makes good sense.
I'll just say one more thing. I think it's really your comments just got my brain thinking. Like I really, even in all my Zoom classes, grief, we're talking about grief, even if the class is completely not related to grief. We have like the first 30 minutes about students talking about their losses. And I think this is going to be after COVID, it's going to be a really interesting avenue, like what you said, to almost normalize losses, and as a channel to talk more about grief. And my closest friend, she lost her dad the same year I lost my dad, and it was kind of like we discussed it as the Dead's Dad Club. Like, we were like, it's the club you never want to be in, but once you're in it, you understand it completely. What's interesting is that's happening now, not on kind of like a 30% basis, hit or miss. I think there's like a global sense of loss and grief. And so it's going to be like what you're just saying is kind of like connecting in my head. Like, you're right. Now everyone is kind of in it. And it is a human. If you're alive long enough to lose something that you're attached to, you will grieve. So everyone will grieve at some point. But the interesting thing is that it's kind of like an equalizer right now that's cutting across all economic classes, all races, all countries, the whole world. So it's really fascinating to think about what's going to happen.
We'll all be in the post-COVID club. We will all eventually be in the post-COVID club.
Yeah.
Well, I like that term. It's the equalizer, because it really is, and it's, you know, as Heather was saying, it's not just even normalizing the idea of loss. It's normalizing the idea of talking about loss, like actually verbalizing it, speaking it, creating a language around it. And what I found is, I've thought about in this process is, even as a field, the death, dying, bereavement field, right? How do we have conversations? Because a new language can be developed in areas that haven't been talking about this. Like, we already have this language. We've created this whole way of talking about it. We have our inside lingo, right? That we go and educate people on all over the world, right? Well, now we have a whole world of people who don't have that language, but they're creating it. And so it's going to be interesting, I think, even to see that. How do we take our conversations and broaden them, and maybe use some of the language we've already developed, in some ways, before others actually create their own, language.
I think people are hungry for this language.
Yeah.
You use the concepts of sort of loss in connection with COVID wherever you are, and people jump on it because it resonates so deeply in terms of sense making around what it is that they're struggling with right now. And I found this case, of course, this is why it's a big part of what I do, and how, you know, people tease me, you know, oh, gains and losses, Heather, you know, because that's the language I use all the time. And now, though, they're using that language with me. They are engaged in it now. They're not teasing me now, right? In it, they're very much connected to it. And it's been a part too for my research group where it's like, how can we make a difference right now? And I said, the more you have these conversations where you use this language, where you offer this conceptualization to people, the more they will spread that, and the more normalizing will happen with regard to how people are processing what they're experiencing right now, right? It's very easy for people to pathologize what they're dealing with right now. I mean, and to make it something, you know, negative. I mean, it is difficult, right? But to make it something like somehow internally problematic about how they're structured as a person, when really this is a natural response to this very difficult sort of, you know, just tragedy or chaos that we're experiencing. Yeah. I see that Steve has his hand up.
Thank you.
Unmute here. Okay. My quick question is, you mentioned that you did kind of a survey with students about, you know, what their major losses, what their most stressful situations were over the past 2 years. How do you get that out into the campus community, and how is that administered, and who, you know, what percentages of students on a campus fill that out? And
Sure. Good question. So my research team, because they study a variety of different life events that students experience, we've done it a number of times. We've only done it on our campus, although I did do it when I was on sabbatical at the University of Hawaii in Manoa, and the results came out very similar there. We don't get the greatest response rate from students, and it is a random sample of the students that we send the study out to, and then we get a percentage of those back. But I would say on a campus of 44,000 students, we still get a good number of students who respond, such that we can see the consistency over time of these stressors that students experience. And in terms of the ones I mentioned, particularly the academic setbacks, financial difficulties, which I think I failed to mention last time, career indecision, and the romantic breakups. Those are like the top 5, right? The students really consistently report as very challenging and very difficult for them.
So is this all across freshmen up through seniors that get this, or how?
Yep. It's generally been all, although the last time we did it, we did just do first year students. And the types of events were still consistent in terms of the top 10 for certain. So I think that I've mentioned either here or prior all 10 of them. So one of the things that we actually did also in the Honors College was we used those 10 to do things with, right? So really focusing on having opportunities for students to talk about death loss, which we have a very active AMF chapter right now. I'll offer that actually our AMF chapter is more active now in the virtual world than it was in person. I think students find it more possible to come when they're just at home and they can just click on a link versus having to find the time and be able to walk to wherever the meeting is happening. We also put together a video collection within the Honors College this year, where we had seniors who are willing to share their experience with each of these significant life events. We don't have someone who's talked about a death loss yet, but the one we just launched was about financial difficulties and the idea of having 2 jobs all the way through college, right? And struggling with being able to make it through and to pay each year to continue in college. And so we're trying to use those stressors and that information about those stressors to offer targeted messages back to students. And one of the things we talk a lot about, and I think Catherine, you sort of alluded to this, the most common sort of approach to coping that college students use is avoidance. And it's the least effective. I mean, it's one of the most consistent findings within the coping literature for college students. And so our messages back to them are, yes, we know you're having these stressful life events. We know you feel very alone about them. Here are stories of other students who are also experiencing these same stressors. You're not alone. And then the protocol that we used to ask them questions was based on a sense banking model. So how did you cope that was effective? How did you cope that wasn't effective? And then what did you learn about the way along the way? How did you make sense of these stressors in a way that there were lessons for your life that you can take forward as you move, and grow and develop? That's a very long answer to the question, but that's what we've done with some of that information. And then, of course, we talk about the losses and the gains. So, because I think there's potential gains in the midst of COVID as well. And they don't offset the losses. I mean, the issue is we need to be able to hold both, right? We need to recognize and acknowledge the losses while also allow for the idea that there might be gains, like more time with individuals that we may not have spent time with, more flexibility, more sleep. Some of my students are reporting they're sleeping more because they're not having to run around. I don't know where you all are, but just trying to also hold that sense that our lives are dynamic and complicated. So.
Well, it reminds me of that sense of equilibrium that any of us need in our lives, right? You can't just ignore a reality that's difficult, but at the same time, if you go too far in that direction and you don't recognize that there are also opportunities, that there are good things in our lives, if you can't do both, there's that sense of imbalance personally, and even even corporately, like even as groups, we can have that sense of imbalance, how we look at things.
So Heather, we have a question in our chat asking if the videos you mentioned, if they're available to the public.
We are going to be putting them on the YouTube channel for the Honors College at Purdue. I'm not sure if they're on it yet, but that YouTube channel is public. And so right now, I know that we're sending them out to the students. I'm not sure how long it will take for them to be public. They're releasing one a week. And so we just released the first one, and then we'll be continuing. We only have 7. And we don't have we don't have romantic breakup yet, and we don't have a death loss yet. But we have pretty good representation of the others. We had students talk about us. Well, the next one will probably be a student who talks about an emergency kidney surgery that she had, which was very powerful experience for her.
I want to go and talk about the work you're doing with bereavement leave policy, but before we switch gear a bit, I'd like to see if anybody else who perhaps may not even be visible would like to jump in with a question thus far.
Can I say one more thing? I don't want to ask so many questions, but before we kind of switch topics, I just want to say your response to how you're handling bereaved students is the gold standard. Like, that is like what I would have wanted during my time. And I think what I found is that the expectations on students, even myself as like an athlete, I was very involved in everything. The expectations don't change because the faculty, if they're non-bereaved, like, there's not enough psychoeducation on. I think that will lead into like bereavement leave policy. It's like everything is so individual. The avoidance, I think, on my part was heightened because I kept hitting brick walls of even my coach being like, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" And I'm just like, "I don't know why I'm crying. Like, I just can't come to practice anymore. Like, I will not leave my dorm room." And so I think it's really tragic. And I lost my dad in 2015, so it wasn't that long ago. So I think bereaved students are really hitting brick walls in terms of expectations on students are already high enough. And I mean, they are what they are. But for bereaved students, there's no understanding of, it's either you show up as the self that you've been kind of displaying. And for young people, emerging adults, we have our self that we want to display, and if I couldn't be charismatic, Catherine, then I'm not going to show up anywhere, And so I think there's a really interesting struggle for students to show up as they are because there's no understanding on the other side. And given that there's no universal bereavement leave policy, that's just a structural indication that there is no understanding, and it is kind of like, do it on your own. And just that there's no universal kind of response from professors. It's a hit or miss. So it's kind of like, you gotta hope that one of the professors has the empathetic capacity large enough to know what you're going through, or else you might be screwed. So
my youngest daughter, I want to pigtail on that. They piggyback on that. My youngest daughter, her grandmother died a few months ago, and it was a sudden thing to where they had to just drop everything, get in the car, and come to be able to say goodbye. And so then we were doing a funeral within a couple of days. So she emailed her professors and had 5 different professors. 4 of the emails back were just what you would want. They were just pleasant and so sorry for your loss, and let me know if I can be supportive, whatever. The 5th one, though, was very short, and it just simply said, I'll need to see you when you get back. Please bring the death certificate. And that was her response, so it is varied, and not having that consistent, and it was upsetting to my daughter. I mean, I tried to get her to focus on the 4, the balance, well, 4 were really nice. And she's like, yeah, but, so anyway, interesting.
I see that Jazz has a question.
Yes, I do, Fran, real quick. So Dr. Servaty-Sieb, I hope I said that correctly.
You can just say SS, that's fine too. Students call me SS.
Okay, SS, I like that. So I just wanted to kind of echo one of the things that you said that really hit home about, I think, some things that I've been thinking about over the past few days. And one of the main points that you brought up is that we need to help people conceptualize what is going on so people do not begin to pathologize. Mm-hmm. Now, I've been listening to a lot of different webinars, and we've talked about you know, a lot of increased and heightened fear, anxiety, and a broken sense of safety that a lot of people are experiencing. But I've still not heard a lot of, you know, grief, death, dying, loss brought into a lot of these conversations. And one of the things that came to mind when you were talking there is one of the articles, that discomfort you are feeling with grief. I'm not sure if anybody's looked into that,
Yes.
but David Kessler has shared some very important thoughts in there about grief and anticipatory grief, which, you know, the majority of the population is probably experiencing. You know, a concern that I'm having, and I'm probably not alone in this, is that we are still not referring to it as grief. So there could be a lot of this suppression and containment of these feelings and mixed emotions that everybody is having. And, you know, just trying to do what is within our field, what is within our control, because we keep talking about trying to control what is within our control. And I think importantly, you've all mentioned this is a time where we can really open up discussion around some of these topics and the field that we are working in. And I think there's definitely, there's room for that, the engagement and that discussion. And you know, sharing of resources, bringing articles to the forefront, or creating room for discussion is something that we can do, which is within our control. And that helps me to personally conceptualize, you know, within myself. So I'm wondering if you had any more thoughts around that, because there, I mean, there is a fear that this could lead to a lot of pathologizing if we're not addressing to what essentially is grief and loss that a lot of people are probably experiencing right now.
Yeah. And I think what I connect to with what you offered is that I'm not always a big fan of the term anticipatory grief, to be quite honest with you. Because when I think about anticipatory grief, even if we think about it in a dying process sort of way, I don't think it's anticipating. It's actually grieving the losses that are occurring in that moment. Does that make sense? I think that's very different. Like, I think we can maybe anticipate a death, and have grief for that anticipation, but not very well. Like, once the death happens, it's completely different than what we anticipated it might be. I don't really think we can anticipate post-death grief. I just don't think we can. But that doesn't mean we're not experiencing grief prior to a death. We are grieving the losses that are happening then. We are grieving the deterioration, perhaps, of the person's physical functioning. We are grieving the loss of activities that we can engage in with them. I mean, all of the losses that happen before a death. I don't know that that makes a difference at all in terms of the post-death grief that's connected to the death, or that we can really anticipate what that's like. I don't think we're good at that, actually. So I just don't prefer that term at all. I think, so to me, that anticipatory grief term could be problematic in the way that you are wanting, and I am wanting, people to be aware of, to have heightened conceptualization of the losses that they truly are experiencing now, and grieving those losses for what they are. And I do agree. I think I was in a webinar yesterday for Purdue. There were a lot of faculty and staff, and I challenged them. Are you having these conversations in your meetings? Are you talking with each other about the losses that you are experiencing right now? Are you using this sort of loss gain language to be able to express to each other what you are experiencing, and to support one another in the unique sort of profile of loss and gain that you are all and each in the midst of right now? And it was really a call to action for them, a challenge to them. You know, when you're having these virtual meetings, are you starting them out with a conversation about losses and gains and where everybody is in that moment? And I know, Catherine, you said some of your classes start that way, but I think actually adding the terms, it makes a difference in terms of the patience and kindness that we show ourselves and others in the midst of all that we're trying to cope with.
Interesting. So there's a question, I believe, unless it's been answered again from Marge in the chat, and it reads, so part of what I'm trying to assist with is that sense of loss of control, things not going the way people expected to go, coming to terms with the unexpected turn of events. How would you approach this? not sure if we covered that question completely.
Well, and I think that loss of control is one of the hardest losses that we are in the midst of now. And I think I'll just do a shout out too to Darcy Harris, who talks a lot, right, about non-death losses, and just did a webinar or a conversation for ADEC recently, and I would encourage you to check it out. But the title of her talk was, we are basically the loss of living our lives. That's what we're experiencing right now, is the loss of living our lives. And that really has to do with that idea of control and the restriction, which was an earlier, I think, part of Margie's comment. All of the restrictions that we're facing now, all of the barriers, all of the walls in terms of being engaged with one another in the way that we want to and need to be. It's all very social, right? It's all very relational. Those are the biggest losses, because those are the biggest points of grounding for us, and our biggest points of well-being is really in our relationships. And so in terms of not being able to be in nursing homes, not being able to be there when individuals we love are dying, I mean, that's just so powerful right now. And I think, as you say, Marge, you know, really trying to work with them on the unexpectedness of it, and the sort of taking the reality for what it is, and then trying to creatively respond to it in a way where we can take back some of that control. You know, what are the aspects of being present that are still possible through mediums like the one that we're engaged in right now, right? Through Zoom, through telephone, going back to the telephone and being engaged with each other in telephone. It is not the same, because when we're talking about people being in pain and being alone, the physical presence is what we crave, and we just can't have that right now. And to be able to talk about that explicitly, but then to try to be creative as much as we possibly can to be with one another. We need to focus, right, on the idea that this is physical distancing. It's not social distancing, right? We need to bring back the social in whatever means possible.
Yeah, I jump up and down when I hear on the news, you know, social distancing. I'm like, no, we need the social connections. It's physical distancing. So important in its subliminal meaning, let alone the actual wording of it. I mean, it's so important.
It is really important.
Well, and you think about even with this whole idea of not being able to be with a spouse when they die, or even to, you know, have services where we're all with people and supported. But there is this idea that it is something that we're all dealing with. So again, I think sometimes bringing back that context of normalizing the experience of what I've seen in working with bereaved people, just to get in the room with other people who say, I also experienced this. Mm-hmm. It doesn't change the pain of grief, but somehow it does put things in perspective for us to say, oh my God, I'm not alone. Like, I'm not the only person who wasn't able to be there. There's someone who gets the nuance that I'm referring to here, right? And so somehow there's a piece of that we talked about earlier, where it's that normalizing this universal experience that we're all having right now, even though it's abnormal times, that is normal under the circumstances, you know, and you're not alone. Yeah.
So Heather, you've done tremendous research in the field, brought so much information to light. You're also really, I want to say, a change maker. You've really worked you've been very involved with bereavement leave policies for students. Can you talk more about that?
I wish that there was more progress, but there
You're
is
leading the charge. You're leading the charge.
Which is good. So so the policy at Purdue has been in place since 2011, which is amazing, but is really great. And it goes back again to the idea of even having a policy speaks to that sense of recognition, and in and of itself pushes back against the disenfranchisement that is there for grieving college students. What I love the most about it is that it does provide this one place for students to go. If there is some sort of proof needed, they provide it one time. There's so much flexibility in it now because everything is online, and so it becomes much more easy to share that kind of information when it's required. And then all the faculty learn at once. And now at Purdue, it's also the academic advisors that learn. And so they are able to be a resource for students. We've been trying to get it also possible for residential life to learn, but it's a completely separate system on our campus. And so it's not a conceptual barrier, it's a practical logistical barrier that we're dealing with right now. But it makes a huge difference for students to know there's one place, and then everyone finds out. And the faculty, even still though, I will say, sometimes push back. I think it's less than did before, which is wonderful. And I think it gives others on campus the opportunity to be supportive. I know when our advisors learn of a death notification, they send an actual physical card to the campus address of the student. That is a bereavement card with a couple of quotes that we have picked within the Honors College anyways, we do. And it just opens up the possibility for more conversation. One of the things that's happening now is that the policy is changing actually, and it was just approved by the University Senate to have more flexibility. So one of my graduate students and I said, we published a study last year where we had gotten feedback on the policy at Purdue, and the students wanted more flexibility, they wanted more days, they wanted an easier way to request use of the leave in the evenings and on the weekends. And now Purdue has an online form that students fill out. They don't have to go or call during business hours. They can do it online, which is wonderful. And they're starting on July 1, there'll be more flexibility in terms of the days. Students will be able to use a day or days prior to a death if they want to be able to go while a family member is ill, which was not allowed before. And there's more flexibility in terms of the days, the number of days, and also the use of those days so that they could be used even later in the semester, say. And it'll still be interesting to see how that's implemented and how that sort of lives practically on the campus. But I was so pleased that the campus was open to the students' voices around the need for more flexibility in how the policy is written and how it's used. So from our last study, we know there's about 44 institutions that have bereavement leave policies. And some institutions, I think some don't need it because some are small and all the faculty are there because they're highly engaged in student life. But there are a lot of institutions that are big like Purdue, and I don't think Purdue is some, particularly negative sort of place around bereavement. Not at all. I just think that it's so huge that it's too easy for students to fall through the cracks. And there is going to be that percentage of faculty, as Andy alluded to, who push back no matter what. And now the Dean of Students here can spend their energy just on those faculty. And all the rest, if it's really particularly problematic, that's where they can put their energy in advocating for students, and that's exactly what they do. So it streamlines everything. And sometimes I get a little, with my colleagues who push back, I say, you study physics. You know what's going on with physics, right? I study this, and this is what needs to happen. And you need to be respectful of specialty areas, right? You are not an expert at saying what a grieving student needs. And this policy is informed by the research and the scholarship in this area, let alone the fact that in every other kind of setting, bereavement leave is practically a human right. And on college campuses, it just has not been for students, which is just wrong. So try to make things move in a direction that's more reasonable and logical based on the way the rest of the world works.
We recently had a student who accomplished an incomplete for one of her classes, because her grief took her on a much more prolonged journey than what the campus would allow it to be. And so she was very excited to have been able to have gotten that. And I think, Kate, do you have a question? Do you want me to read it, or do you want to just ask in?
Oh, I typed it out, but I can read it. I was wondering how at Purdue you guys decided how far the bereavement plan spreads in terms of who has died, because at my grad university, as well as my undergrad university, there was always a discussion of, you know, is it immediate family? How far do we extend? And actually at my grad school, they only recognize immediate family deaths. And I was wondering how you kind of determine how far to go, because obviously people can mean something huge to you that aren't in your immediate family.
Great, that's a great question. And the way the policy started initially was that it almost completely paralleled the faculty and staff policy in terms of the relationships that were mentioned. I think that's a really good place to start on a campus when you're trying to advocate, is to try to parallel the faculty and staff policy as much as possible, because that's very difficult for the administration to argue against. You know, all of your faculty and staff get it. Why wouldn't the students get the same? But then we have to think beyond that in terms of, at Purdue, for example, grandparents are considered immediate family. So even what we define as immediate family is very different. And there are different days allowed. So all students can get, if it's a family member, they can get at least 1 day. I mean, but if it's an immediate family member, right, then they can have more. And I think the days actually, I'd have to go back in terms of the specific days, but the days for each relational death loss increased with this revision that will go in place in July. Even beyond what the faculty and staff are allowed, because the students were able to advocate, we need more. You know, this is where we are developmentally. Give us a break. I mean, so I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind. The other thing that a policy allows is that, say, that the policy also asks if you lived with the person, which was an interesting sort of piece, even initially, that the students wanted to have in the policy. But you can advocate for death losses that are not a part of the policy. And now ODOS has more time, the Dean of Students Office has more time for those appeals that students bring, because the policy takes care of the death losses where there's no question, or there's no, you know, sort of, it's not as questioned by people as much. So a friend is not listed in the bereavement leave policy here at Purdue. And that doesn't mean, though, that a student can't use the policy. They just have to do a bit more in terms of contacting the office about that death. Mm-hmm.
So Heather, we just have a few minutes left, but I did want to give a chance. I know people who are listening in or participating in the discussion now, and those who will listen, I'm sure, in the future, are going to want to know how they can connect with you, connect with your research. How might they do that?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of my research, I mean, it can be found on Google Scholar, of course, if people are interested in finding out more about the work that my research team has done. Because as you mentioned, Andy, most of my work is with others, you know, collaborative work with either my students or colleagues. I would like to do a little bit of a shout out for the book we have of narratives from grieving college students called We Get It, which is available on Amazon. I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of, working with David Feigenbaum, because it is such a resource for students themselves, and also a resource for those who want to be helpful to students, including their peers. I think being able to read narratives from grieving college students is as close as you can come to having conversations. And I remember when that book came out, one of the people we work with at the publishing house said, "This is like a portable support group." And we were like, exactly. That's exactly what we were going for. And so that's a way as well. I think in terms of the gain and loss framework, I would say that if you put in the grief and loss research team at Purdue, you will see a subset where it talks about the gain loss framework, and also the measure that we've developed called the Perceived Impact of Life Event Scale, which allows you to sort of interact with, we see it as clinical and empirical both, because we have individuals who are using it in clinical settings. So people pick a life event and then indicate the gains and losses they attribute to that life event through the measure. And so we use it in our research, but we also have centers that are using it, like with caregivers of those who have Parkinson's. It's used in centers with teenagers with pregnancy. It's being used in VAs. It's often used in counseling centers. We have a college student version of it as well. So those are some options. And then if I can be of assistance directly, my email at Purdue is quite easy. If you have my name, it's the first part of my last name, Servaty, at purdue.edu.
Thank you so much. Well, Heather, we want to really thank you for being our guest here for this discussion forum and for sharing your research with our audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm so glad to have a chance to interact with each of you. Zoom has this great feature, right, where you look at everyone at the same time in this kind of setting, and I think that's a gain that will be interesting over time. I wonder if we'll do more of this even when we don't have to.
I think we will.
I hope we will. And so with that, we also want to thank those of you who joined us for the discussion, and thank you for interacting. Thank you for asking your questions and making your comments. It's made our conversation so much richer. So thank you for that. And those who will be listening in, we thank you for listening in on this, on the recording as well. If you want to learn more about Heal Grief, you can just visit us at healgrief.org, and we encourage you to do that. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all the programs and resources that Heal Grief has, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward, AMF.
Make sure to join our AMF app so you too can be part of the next Q&A.
Yeah, and so thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on our next AMF app members discussion forum. Thank you.